Morning arrives quietly at Versailles. The first light of the sun slips across the gardens. It touches marble balustrades, clipped hedges, still fountains. A faint wind moves through rows of perfectly measured trees, a geometry imposed on nature 3 centuries ago and maintained, even now, with obsessive care. Inside the palace, silence lingers in the long corridors. The Hall of Mirrors waits in stillness. 17 towering windows face the rising sun. Opposite them, 17 mirrors catch the light and scatter it into gold. The parquet floors reflect the glow. Crystal chandeliers hang like frozen constellations. No voices yet, no footsteps, just the architecture of power, resting. For a moment, Versailles appears exactly as it was meant to be seen. Serene, symmetrical, eternal, a palace of perfect order. But Versailles was never only a palace, it was a machine. And like any machine, it ran on inputs, outputs, pressure, and cost. Behind the gold leaf and polished mirrors lay an immense system, one that consumed labour, wealth, attention, and political energy on a national scale. Every corridor was part of the system, every ceremony was an operation, every room had a function. Versailles was not simply built to impress, it was built to govern. To understand Versailles, we must move quickly through its scale, because the numbers alone feel almost impossible. At its height, Versailles contained more than 700 rooms, grand apartments for the king and queen, suites for princes and princesses, endless chambers for ministers, nobles, servants, clerks, musicians, guards, cooks and craftsmen. An entire city compressed into a palace. Outside stretched nearly 2,000 acres of gardens, terraces, fountains, groves, canals, statues, engineered perspectives designed to make nature itself appear obedient. Everything aligned toward the king, everything radiating from a single centre. On ordinary days, several thousand people lived or worked inside the palace complex. Courtiers from across France arrived seeking favour. Diplomats came to negotiate. Guards patrolled the gates. Stable hands cared for thousands of horses. Bakers prepared bread for the royal household. Tailors stitched ceremonial garments that might only be worn once, and this was only the visible population. Beyond the palace walls stretched a hidden workforce, farmers supplying food, artisans producing luxury goods, tax collectors gathering revenue, bureaucrats managing shipments of wine, grain, meat, candles, firewood, silk, lace, all of it moving toward Versailles, all of it feeding the machine. Each morning began with ritual. The king woke according to schedule. The ceremony was called the lever, the rising. A carefully choreographed event where nobles gathered simply to watch the king wake, dress, and begin his day. Not everyone could enter. Access was ranked, layered, controlled. The highest nobles stood closest. Lesser courtiers waited farther back. Many were allowed only a glimpse through an open doorway. Even proximity had hierarchy. Even breathing the same air as the king had value. Because in Versailles, access was currency. From the lever to the council meetings, from public meals to evening entertainments, from hunting expeditions to midnight conversations in candle-lit corridors, every moment of royal life became a stage, and thousands watched. Why? Because power in France did not only reside in laws or armies, it resided in attention, in proximity, in visibility. Versailles turned the king's daily life into a continuous performance of authority. But performances require infrastructure. Every candle burned through tallow. Every fountain required water pressure from distant reservoirs. Every feast demanded deliveries of meat, bread, fruit, wine, spices. Every costume required silk, lace, embroidery, and time. Every day had a cost, and that cost did not stay inside Versailles. It travelled outward, through tax systems, through provincial economies, through the fragile finances of a kingdom already strained by war, debt, and inequality. The palace shone brilliantly, but the light had a shadow. Visitors in the 17th century described Versailles as the greatest palace Europe had ever seen. Diplomats wrote of endless gardens, astonishing halls, and a court whose magnificence seemed almost divine. The palace made a statement. France was powerful, France was rich, France was ordered around a single sun, Louis XIV, the Sun King. But spectacle has a strange property. The larger it becomes, the more resources it consumes just to maintain itself. More courtiers, more ceremonies, more buildings, more fountains, more gardens, more staff. The machine grows, and machines, once built, rarely shrink. Versailles demanded constant expansion. New wings, larger gardens, additional stables, fresh decorations, endless maintenance, paint fades, stone cracks, water systems fail. The machine must keep running, and so it did. For decades, through triumphs, through wars, through mounting financial pressure that few inside the palace walls fully understood. Because Versailles had another function, one less visible than its architecture. It reorganized power itself. Before Versailles, the great nobles of France held authority in their provinces. They commanded local armies, controlled lands, governed distant territories far from the king's immediate reach. Versailles changed that. Instead of ruling their regions, nobles began living near the king. Instead of commanding armies, they competed for invitations. Instead of governing land, they learned etiquette. The palace did something revolutionary. It absorbed the elite. It turned potential rivals into spectators. A brilliant strategy. But every strategy has a price. Because while nobles competed for honour in glittering halls, the administrative state of France grew larger and more complex. Wars expanded, taxes multiplied, debt accumulated, grain harvests fluctuated, population increased, and the financial arithmetic of the kingdom became increasingly fragile. Versailles glittered above it all, mirrors reflecting sunlight, music echoing through galleries, fountains rising and falling with mechanical precision. Yet beneath the elegance, pressures were building, economic pressures, social pressures, political pressures. Versailles did not create all of them, but it concentrated attention on one place, one symbol, one palace that represented the entire structure of royal authority. If the machine ran smoothly, Versailles looked magnificent. If the machine faltered, Versailles looked extravagant, even dangerous. Because beauty can inspire loyalty, but it can also provoke anger, especially when the bill arrives. For more than a century, Versailles stood at the centre of French power, a masterpiece of architecture, choreography and political design. Kings ruled from its rooms, diplomats negotiated under its ceilings, armies marched in the king's name. Yet the deeper story of Versailles is not simply about gold and gardens. It is about systems, about incentives, about the delicate balance between spectacle and sustainability. A balance that would slowly, almost invisibly, begin to fail. And when it failed, the consequences would not remain confined to palace walls. They would spread across an entire kingdom. Until one day, the people themselves would come to Versailles, not as spectators, but as a force the palace had never been designed to contain. Because the most important question about Versailles is not how beautiful it was. It is something far more unsettling. If Versailles was a machine built to control power, what happens when the machine becomes too large for the country that feeds it? Versailles did not begin as a grand idea. It began as mud. In the early 17th century, the land west of Paris was little more than a damp hunting ground. Flat forests, scattered villages, shallow ponds. The soil was heavy with clay. Roads dissolved into sludge after rain. Travellers described the region as remote and unpleasant. There was no palace here, only a modest hunting lodge built in 1623 by Louis XIII. The structure was small, almost defensive in character. Brick walls, slate roof, a place to sleep between hunts, a retreat from Paris rather than a seat of power. But in 1643, a 4-year-old boy inherited the throne of France. Louis XIV. His reign would last 72 years, the longest of any major European monarch, and during those decades, the quiet hunting lodge of his father would transform into the most elaborate palace complex in Europe. But the transformation was not merely architectural, it was strategic. To understand Versailles, we must understand the political trauma that shaped the young king. In the late 1640s, France descended into a series of civil conflicts known as the Fronde. Nobles rebelled. Parlement resisted royal authority. Armed factions fought in the streets of Paris. The monarchy itself became vulnerable. At one point, the royal family was forced to flee the capital in the middle of the night. For the young king, the lesson was unforgettable. Paris was dangerous. The nobility could not be trusted, and proximity to power was a risk. If the monarchy was to survive, truly survive, it needed a new system. Not just stronger armies, not just more taxes, a different architecture of power. Years later, when Louis XIV took full control of government in 1661 after the death of his chief minister Cardinal Mazarin, he made a decision that would reshape France. He would move the centre of government away from Paris, and he would build something unprecedented. A palace that functioned not only as a residence but as a political instrument. Versailles would become that instrument. The project began modestly. At first, the king simply expanded his father's hunting lodge. Architects surrounded the original building with larger wings. Gardens began to stretch outward. Decorative programs multiplied, but quickly the ambition grew. By the late 1660s, Versailles was no longer an expansion. It was a total redesign of royal authority. And the architect most responsible for shaping the physical language of that authority was Louis XIV, followed later by Jules Hardouin-Mansart. Together with landscape designer André Le Nôtre and interior decorator Charles Lebrun, they created something remarkable. Not simply buildings, a spatial hierarchy. Every axis in Versailles leads toward the king. Walk through the gardens and the lines converge on the palace. Stand inside the palace and the corridors converge on the royal apartments. Even the most famous room, the Hall of Mirrors, sits precisely between the king's chamber and the gardens, turning architecture itself into a symbolic bridge between nature and monarchy. Order radiates outward from the king's bed. This was not accidental. Louis XIV understood something profound about politics. Power must be visible, but it must also be structured. If nobles were allowed to remain scattered across France, they retained their regional influence, their private armies, their independent networks of loyalty. Versailles offered an alternative. Bring them all to court, keep them close, keep them competing. Instead of plotting rebellion in distant provinces, the nobility would compete for something far more immediate. Access. Access to the king, and access could be regulated through ritual. This is where Versailles becomes truly extraordinary. Because the palace did not merely host ceremonies, it turned everyday life into governance. Consider the king's morning, the lever. When Louis XIV woke, the event unfolded in stages. First came the petit lever, a small group of privileged nobles allowed into the king's chamber while he began dressing. Then the grand lever, a larger gathering including high-ranking courtiers, ministers, and officials. Each stage had rules. Who could hand the king his shirt? Who could hold a candle? Who could stand closest? Who had to wait outside? These details may sound trivial. They were not. In Versailles, symbolic proximity translated into real influence. If a noble could speak to the king during the lever even briefly, he might secure a military command, a tax exemption, a marriage approval, a provincial appointment. Every second mattered, and the king controlled the schedule. Even the act of watching the king eat became political theatre. During public dinners, courtiers gathered to observe Louis XIV at table. The food arrived in elaborate sequences. Servants moved with choreographed precision. Guards stood in formal positions. Hundreds watched the king eat. Why? Because visibility confirmed legitimacy. The king was not hidden. He was radiant, present, central, a human sun around which the court revolved. This is where the famous image of Louis XIV as the Sun King truly emerges. The sun rises, planets orbit. Light radiates outward. Versailles mirrored that cosmic structure. The king at the centre, the court revolving around him, France beyond. It was political astronomy. But maintaining this system required constant participation. If nobles wanted influence, they had to live at Versailles, and living at Versailles was expensive. Court dress alone could cost enormous sums. Ceremonial garments demanded the finest silk, lace, embroidery and jewellery. Appearances mattered. Status had to be displayed visually. Then there were apartments. Not everyone received a luxurious suite. Many nobles lived in cramped rooms carved into attic spaces or converted corridors. Competition for better accommodations was intense, but even poor rooms were valuable because they were inside the machine, and inside meant proximity. Over time, something remarkable happened. The old military aristocracy, once a potential threat to royal authority, became dependent on court life. Their fortunes tied to royal favour, their ambitions tied to ceremony, their status tied to visibility within the palace. Versailles did not destroy the nobility. It domesticated them. The strategy worked. For decades, France became the dominant cultural power in Europe. Foreign ambassadors studied Versailles carefully. Other monarchs copied its architecture, its gardens, its court rituals. The palace became a model of absolutist authority. But even a brilliant design has consequences, because while nobles competed inside Versailles, another class quietly gained influence outside it. Administrators, lawyers, financial officials, men trained not in war but in paperwork. The royal bureaucracy expanded, taxes were calculated, loans negotiated, supply systems organised. The kingdom was becoming more complex, economically, demographically, politically. And complexity requires resources: more soldiers, more roads, more ships, more grain, more taxes. Versailles helped stabilise the monarchy by controlling the nobility. But it also created a new dependency. The palace needed constant revenue to function: the ceremonies, the staff, the buildings, the endless maintenance of gardens and fountains. Every element of the system required money, and that money had to come from somewhere. At first, France could afford it. The kingdom was large, productive, ambitious, but the machine was only beginning to grow, because Louis XIV did not intend Versailles to remain merely functional. He intended it to become overwhelming, a palace so magnificent that no one, noble, diplomat, or foreign ruler, could ever doubt the supremacy of France. And so the building continued: larger wings, greater halls, vaster gardens, more fountains, more courtiers, more spectacle. The system worked beautifully, at least at first. But the deeper question remained quietly unresolved. If Versailles concentrated power so effectively, how much pressure could the system endure before the machinery itself began to strain? To visitors, Versailles appeared inevitable. The palace rose from the landscape as if it had always belonged there. Terraces descending into gardens, fountains erupting in perfect symmetry, long canals reflecting the sky. But nothing about Versailles was natural. Every stone, every tree, every drop of water had to be forced into place. And forcing it into place required one of the largest logistical operations in early modern Europe, because Versailles was not only designed, it was manufactured. Construction accelerated after 1661, when Louis XIV announced that the hunting lodge would become the permanent centre of royal power. From that moment forward, the quiet forest clearing became a national construction site. Workers arrived by the thousands: stonecutters from Burgundy, carpenters from Normandy, masons, plasterers, sculptors, blacksmiths, tile makers, gardeners, engineers. At peak periods, historians estimate that 20,000 to 30,000 labourers were working on the project simultaneously. The scale was unprecedented. Stone blocks travelled along muddy roads pulled by teams of horses. Timber floated down rivers before being dragged across fields toward the site. Lime kilns burned day and night to produce mortar. Supply wagons arrived continuously: wood, iron, glass, marble, lead. All of it needed coordination. All of it needed payment. Versailles became less like a building site and more like an industrial operation, decades before the Industrial Age. And the work was relentless. Winters froze scaffolding into brittle frames. Summers baked the clay soil into dust clouds that coated every worker and tool. Accidents were frequent. Illness spread easily in the crowded camps surrounding the palace. Yet construction rarely stopped, because Versailles was tied directly to royal prestige, and prestige had deadlines. Foreign ambassadors visited, court festivals were scheduled, diplomatic ceremonies demanded new rooms, new gardens, new decorations. The machine could not pause. Architects pushed forward. Louis XIV began the transformation by surrounding the old hunting lodge with elegant stone wings, preserving the original building inside a new shell like a relic embedded within a monument. Later, Jules Ardouin Mansart expanded the project dramatically. He extended the palace outward, added vast new courtyards, and created the most famous space in Versailles, the Hall of Mirrors. 17 windows facing the gardens, 17 mirrored arches opposite them. At the time, mirrors were among the most expensive luxury items in Europe. Producing glass that large required specialized Venetian techniques that France had only recently begun to replicate. Installing dozens of them in a single hall was not simply decoration. It was a statement of industrial power. But if the palace was impressive, The gardens were astonishing, because gardens require control. Control over soil, control over growth, control over water. And at Versailles, water was the greatest problem of all. The palace stood on relatively dry land. There were no large rivers nearby capable of feeding the enormous fountains envisioned by the king and his designers. Yet the fountains were essential. They represented mastery over nature. Water rising, falling, dancing through engineered basins, synchronized with music and ceremony. Without water, Versailles would be incomplete. So engineers searched for solutions. Reservoirs were dug, ponds were connected through hidden channels, pumps were installed to move water uphill across long distances. Thousands of pipes ran beneath the gardens, but even these systems struggled to keep up with demand. When the king walked through the gardens, attendants rushed ahead to activate fountains only moments before he arrived. As soon as he passed, they shut them off again to conserve pressure. The spectacle was carefully rationed, yet even this was not enough, so the crown commissioned one of the most ambitious hydraulic machines of the 17th century, the machine de Marly. Constructed along the Seine River several kilometres away, the machine used massive water wheels, some more than 12 metres in diameter, to power a complex chain of pumps lifting water uphill toward Versailles. The device was gigantic, 14 water wheels, hundreds of pumps, miles of pipes climbing the hillside. The machine creaked and thundered continuously, a forest of wooden gears and metal rods transferring energy from the river to the palace fountains. Visitors described it as both miraculous and terrifying. But even the machine de Marly struggled to fully satisfy Versailles' thirst. The gardens demanded more, always more, because the gardens were not merely decorative landscapes, they were theatre. André Lenoir designed them as a series of controlled perspectives. Long axes extended across the terrain, drawing the eye toward distant statues or shimmering pools. Groves hid secret stages where concerts and theatrical performances took place. The Grand Canal, more than a kilometre long, created a horizontal mirror reflecting the sky. Boats sailed across it during royal festivals. Fireworks exploded above it. Thousands of lanterns illuminated its banks during summer celebrations. Versailles was not static. It performed. But performances required maintenance. Trees had to be trimmed constantly to preserve geometric lines. Gravel paths required endless raking. Statues needed cleaning. Fountains needed repair. And the hydraulic system, an enormous underground network, demanded continuous attention. The gardens alone employed hundreds of full-time gardeners. Meanwhile, the palace interior required another army of specialists. Painters refreshed decorative ceilings. Furniture makers replaced worn chairs and tables. Clockmakers maintained hundreds of timepieces. Servants lit thousands of candles every evening, then extinguished them before dawn. Even the mirrors required polishing. Versailles glittered because invisible hands kept it glittering, and those hands were expensive. The cost of construction is difficult to calculate precisely, but estimates suggest that hundreds of millions of livres flowed into the project over decades, a staggering sum for the time, yet the spending rarely appeared in a single account. Funds moved through royal budgets, war finances, and special building programs. Loans covered gaps. Taxes expanded to sustain state expenditures. Versailles did not simply consume money, it absorbed resources from across the kingdom. Stone from distant quarries, timber from royal forests, labour from provincial towns, agricultural production redirected to feed workers and courtiers. The palace became the gravitational centre of a vast supply network. Everything moved toward it, and everything had to keep moving. Because once the court relocated permanently to Versailles in 1682, the construction site became something even more complicated. A palace under construction, a government headquarters, a city of courtiers, a stage for diplomacy, all operating simultaneously. Imagine the daily rhythm. Carriages arriving from Paris with ministers and documents, supply wagons unloading meat, wine, and flour. Masons still hammering stone while nobles in silk crossed the courtyards. Gardeners trimming hedges while musicians rehearsed for evening concerts. Construction never truly ended. Versailles was permanently unfinished. Because prestige is a moving target, if one wing looked magnificent, another needed expansion. If gardens impressed visitors, new groves were designed. If rivals abroad built grand palaces of their own, Versailles had to remain superior. The machine kept growing, and growth introduced complexity. More staff, more logistics, more maintenance, more financial strain. For Louis XIV, the cost was justified. Versailles projected authority across Europe. Ambassadors returned home describing a court of almost mythological splendour. But behind the spectacle, administrators began noticing something subtle. The machine was no longer just expensive to build, it was expensive to operate. Every year required fresh expenditures, every year demanded more revenue, and every new addition increased the permanent cost of the system. Versailles had become something larger than architecture. It had become infrastructure. An infrastructure of prestige, an infrastructure of control, an infrastructure whose maintenance depended on the continued strength of the French state. As long as the state remained strong, Versailles looked eternal. But if the state weakened, the palace would not shrink. It would remain exactly as large as it had been designed to be, demanding the same resources, demanding the same spectacle, demanding the same illusion of limitless power. And illusions, once institutionalized, can become dangerously expensive. Because while thousands of workers built the physical machine of Versailles, another machine was quietly forming inside its walls. A social machine. A court system so intricate that status, money, and survival all depended on navigating it. And once someone entered that system, escape became almost impossible. The palace had been built. But what kind of life did it actually create inside? By the late 17th century, Versailles was no longer a construction project. It was a living organism. Every morning, before the sun had fully warmed the gardens designed by André Le Nôtre, movement began inside the palace. Servants moved through narrow service corridors carrying water, wood, and candles. Guards rotated shifts at the gates. Bakers unloaded bread from wagons arriving before dawn. And above them all, behind gilded doors and thick velvet curtains, the king slept. Louis XIV was not simply a ruler inside Versailles, he was the operating system. Every day inside the palace was structured around his presence, not metaphorically, literally. Thousands of people calibrated their schedules according to the king's movements. When he woke, when he walked through the gardens, when he attended mass, when he ate, when he retired for the night. His routine was governance. The first major moment of the day was the lever, the king's waking ceremony. It began quietly. A handful of highly ranked nobles entered the royal chamber, while attendants opened curtains and lit candles. Doctors examined the king's health. Valets prepared garments laid out the night before. Then more courtiers were admitted. Ranks expanded outward. The rooms slowly filled. Each step followed rules refined over decades. A duke might hold the king's sleeve. A prince might present the shirt. Another noble might pour water for washing. It was choreography. But the choreography had stakes, because each role represented favour, and favour could translate into something far more tangible. Military commands, tax exemptions, land grants, administrative offices. The lever lasted perhaps an hour, yet that hour could determine careers. When the ceremony ended, the king moved into the next sequence of the day: council meetings with ministers, audiences with ambassadors, inspections of military reports, discussions with financial officials. Versailles was theatre, but it was also government. Policies were debated in chambers just steps away from salons where musicians rehearsed and courtiers gossiped. Two worlds coexisted, the administrative state and the spectacle that surrounded it. Around midday came another ritual, the royal meal. Public dining had existed in earlier courts, but at Versailles it became a spectacle of proximity. Nobles crowded into the chamber to watch the king eat at a table raised slightly above the floor. Servants moved with extraordinary precision. Plates arrived in ceremonial sequence. Guards stood along the walls, hundreds watched. The act of eating became symbolic. The king nourished himself. The kingdom was nourished through him. Every gesture reinforced hierarchy. Afterward came walks through the gardens, hunting expeditions in nearby forests, or elaborate entertainments. Concerts, ballets, theatrical performances. The palace rarely slept. Evenings brought candlelight and conversation. Gambling tables appeared in salons. Musicians played until late hours. Courtiers negotiated marriages, alliances, financial arrangements. Everything happened within sight of the king's orbit. But this brilliant choreography masked something more complicated, because life at Versailles was not comfortable for most people who lived there. Space was scarce. The palace had more than 700 rooms, but thousands of individuals required accommodation. Many nobles received small apartments carved into awkward corners of the building. Others rented rooms in the nearby town of Versailles and travelled daily to the palace gates. Privacy barely existed. Walls were thin, corridors crowded. Servants passed constantly, and the competition never stopped. A noble arriving at court entered a system of permanent comparison. Clothing, jewellery, housing, carriages, even the size of a servant retinue communicated status. Maintaining appearances was extraordinarily expensive. Silk garments embroidered with gold thread, lace imported from Italy, powdered wigs carefully styled, decorative swords worn even by men who had never seen battle. One evening of court ceremony might require clothing worth several years of income, and it could only be worn once. Repetition suggested poverty. Poverty suggested decline. Decline suggested loss of favour. Many noble families found themselves trapped in a financial paradox. To remain influential at Versailles, they had to spend. But spending drained their fortunes. Some sold land in their provinces to maintain their appearance at court. Others borrowed heavily. Debts accumulated quietly beneath the glittering surface of palace life. Yet leaving Versailles carried its own risk. Absence meant invisibility. Invisibility meant losing access to the king. And losing access meant political extinction. The system was brilliant and suffocating. But the most revealing layer of Versailles' life was the one visitors rarely saw: the invisible workforce. Behind every ceremony stood hundreds of labourers. Servants lit candles throughout the palace each evening, sometimes more than 3,000 flames glowing simultaneously. Others extinguished them hours later to prevent fires. Kitchen workers prepared enormous quantities of food daily. Meats roasted on turning spits, soups simmering in giant cauldrons, pastries shaped for banquets. Stable hands cared for thousands of horses used by the court. Gardeners trimmed hedges with obsessive precision to maintain the geometric landscapes. Messengers ran documents between ministers. Laundry workers scrubbed linens used by hundreds of residents. The palace functioned because of this hidden labour, and that labour rarely appeared in paintings of Versailles. Those paintings showed nobles dancing beneath chandeliers. They showed elegant promenades through gardens. They showed ambassadors bowing before the king. But they did not show the workers carrying chamber pots through back staircases, or the servants sleeping in cramped attic quarters above gilded ceilings, or the cooks sweating beside enormous hearths through the night. Versailles had two worlds: the visible court and the invisible infrastructure supporting it. Both were enormous, both were expensive, and both depended on a constant flow of resources from the kingdom beyond the palace gates. Food arrived from farms across France, wine from Burgundy, timber from royal forests, luxury textiles from Lyon, silver and porcelain from specialized workshops. Taxes funded the machinery, taxes collected from peasants, merchants, and urban labourers who would never see Versailles, who might never even see Paris. For them, the palace existed only as rumour, a distant symbol of royal magnificence, or, increasingly, royal excess. Because while nobles competed for access inside the palace, the outside world was changing. France was growing, its population expanding rapidly, cities swelling, markets fluctuating, and the monarchy was not only maintaining Versailles, it was also fighting wars, large wars, expensive wars, wars that required soldiers, ships, and enormous financial commitments. Administrators inside Versailles worked constantly to balance these demands: the cost of war, the cost of government, the cost of maintaining the greatest palace in Europe. For decades the system held. But numbers were beginning to shift. Loans accumulated, interest payments grew, tax systems became more aggressive, and ordinary people across the kingdom felt the pressure. Versailles remained magnificent. Candles still glowed in endless rows. Music still echoed through mirrored halls. The machine of court life continued its precise choreography. Yet beyond the palace walls, a different rhythm was emerging. Harvest failures, food shortages, rising bread prices, anger. The palace had been designed to concentrate power, But concentration has a consequence. When admiration fades, all attention focuses on the same place, the same symbol, the same glittering palace that seemed to consume the wealth of a nation. And slowly across France, people began asking a dangerous question. If the kingdom was struggling, why did Versailles still shine so brightly? For decades, Versailles had functioned like a sealed world. Inside the palace, ritual governed time. Courtiers watched the king rise, dine, and retire. Music echoed through candlelit halls. Diplomats bowed beneath painted ceilings celebrating royal triumphs. Outside, however, France was changing, and the arithmetic of the kingdom was beginning to fail. When Louis XIV died in 1715, Versailles had already become the unquestioned centre of royal authority. The system he built, court ritual, centralised administration, noble dependence, remained intact. But it had also inherited his debts. Louis XIV had ruled for 72 years, and much of that time had been consumed by war. Conflicts like the War of the Spanish Succession had stretched French finances to their limits. War required soldiers. Soldiers required pay. Armies required food, horses, artillery, uniforms, and the crown financed much of it through borrowing. By the early 18th century, France carried one of the largest state debts in Europe. Versailles remained brilliant. But beneath the brilliance, the treasury was strained. The problem did not disappear when new kings arrived. Louis XV inherited the system as a child. His reign lasted nearly 60 years, and Versailles continued operating much as it had before. Ceremonies, entertainments, diplomatic receptions, constant maintenance of palace and gardens. But the geopolitical environment had shifted. Rival powers were stronger. Wars were more complex. The monarchy fought conflicts such as the 7 Years' War, a struggle that stretched across Europe, North America, and Asia. The outcome was catastrophic for France. Defeat meant lost colonies, weakened prestige, and staggering financial obligations. Debt multiplied again. And yet Versailles did not shrink. The palace still required staff. The court still required ceremony. The gardens still required hundreds of gardeners. Infrastructure does not easily reduce itself. If anything, the palace had become even more embedded in the identity of the monarchy. To diminish Versailles would signal weakness, and weakness was dangerous for a king claiming absolute authority. So the machine kept running. The next monarch, Louis XVI, inherited not only the palace but also the increasingly unstable financial system supporting it. Louis XVI was not indifferent to the problem. In fact, he recognised the danger. By the late 1770s, royal administrators were desperately searching for solutions. Reform-minded ministers like Jacques Necker and Anne-Robert Jacques Turgot attempted to modernise the kingdom's finances. Their proposals were logical. Reduce court spending, simplify taxes, end exemptions enjoyed by the nobility and clergy, encourage agricultural productivity, control borrowing. But logic collided with politics. Every reform threatened someone powerful. Nobles resisted new taxes, parlements blocked legislation, court factions undermined ministers. The system Versailles had created, a world where influence depended on favour, made structural reform extremely difficult. Because reform meant losing privilege, and those with privilege were closest to the king. Meanwhile, outside Versailles, pressures continued to grow. France's population had expanded dramatically during the 18th century. By the 1780s, nearly 28 million people lived within the kingdom. More mouths, more demand for grain, more vulnerability when harvests failed, and harvests did fail. In the mid-1780s, poor weather damaged crops across large regions of France. Grain shortages pushed bread prices upward. Bread was not a luxury. For most French families, bread was the foundation of survival. When its price doubled, or tripled, entire communities felt the shock. Labourers spent nearly all their income on food. Urban workers faced unemployment during economic downturns. Farmers struggled under a web of taxes and feudal obligations. Anger simmered quietly, and as anger spread, Versailles began to appear less like a symbol of national glory and more like something else. A symbol of imbalance. Stories circulated in markets and taverns, stories about palace banquets, about noble extravagance, about the Queen, Marie Antoinette, whose foreign birth and perceived luxury made her an easy target for public resentment. Many of these stories were exaggerated, some were entirely false. But in politics, perception can matter more than accuracy. The palace seemed distant, indifferent, an island of silk and chandeliers floating above a sea of economic anxiety. At the same time, France faced another expensive decision. In 1778, the monarchy chose to support the American colonies in their rebellion against Britain during the American Revolutionary War. Strategically, it made sense. Weakening Britain served French interests, but the cost was enormous. Ships, weapons, loans to the American rebels, more borrowing, more debt. Victory brought prestige, but not financial relief. By the late 1780s, France's national debt had become overwhelming. Interest payments alone consumed a huge portion of the royal budget, and here the arithmetic of Versailles became impossible to ignore. Because the palace represented something deeper than its own expenses, it symbolized the entire structure of royal authority, a structure built on hierarchy, privilege, and spectacle. If the monarchy could not balance its finances, the legitimacy of that structure itself began to crack. Administrators inside Versailles recognized the danger. In 1788, the Crown made a dramatic decision. For the first time in more than 170 years, the King summoned the Estates General of 1789, a national assembly representing the clergy, the nobility, and the common people. The meeting was meant to solve the financial crisis. Instead, it opened the door to something far larger. Public debate exploded across France. Pamphlets circulated in the thousands. Ordinary citizens began discussing taxes, rights, representation, power. For generations, Versailles had controlled access, controlled ritual, controlled proximity to authority. Now authority itself was being questioned. What did it mean for a king to rule? Who truly represented the nation? And why did the system seem incapable of solving the crisis it had created? Inside Versailles, the court continued its routines. Ceremonies continued, musicians played, courtiers gathered beneath chandeliers. But outside the palace gates, crowds gathered for different reasons. Food shortages worsened, bread prices climbed, rumours spread faster than royal proclamations. The machine of Versailles had always depended on distance. Distance between king and people. Distance between spectacle and hardship. Distance between the palace and the villages that paid for it. That distance was shrinking. Paris was restless. Markets were volatile. And increasingly, ordinary citizens were no longer content to discuss the crisis from afar. They wanted answers. From the king. From the palace. From Versailles itself. For more than a century, the palace had drawn the elite of France toward its gates. But now a different kind of movement was beginning. Not nobles seeking favour, not diplomats seeking alliance, but crowds, angry, hungry, and determined to confront the symbol of power that had dominated their kingdom for generations. The palace had been built as a fortress of ceremony, a machine designed to contain and control the aristocracy. But it had never been designed to contain the people, and soon the people would come, not as spectators, but as a force Versailles had never anticipated. What happens when the greatest palace in Europe must finally face the nation that built it? On the morning of October 5th, 1789, rain fell over Paris. The city had been restless for months. Bread prices remained painfully high. Markets were tense. Rumours travelled faster than official proclamations. By dawn, a crowd gathered near the city's marketplaces. Most were women, market vendors, laundry workers, servants, labourers' wives, women who stood every morning in bread lines, women who understood the arithmetic of hunger better than ministers inside Versailles. They were angry, but they were also organised. At first, the crowd moved toward the City Hall of Paris, demanding grain and political action. Drums echoed through the streets. More people joined along the way. Soon, thousands were marching. Some carried pikes, others carried muskets. Many simply carried determination. Their destination was clear. Versailles, nearly 20 kilometres away. The palace that had dominated French politics for more than a century. The palace where Louis XVI still lived. The palace where bread seemed plentiful. The palace where decisions about the nation's crisis were unfolding slowly, cautiously, surrounded by ceremony. The march began in rain and mud. Along the road west from Paris, the crowd grew larger. Members of the National Guard, the new citizen militia formed during the early days of the Revolution, eventually joined the procession under the command of Gilbert du Motier, Marquis de Lafayette. By afternoon, the column stretched for kilometres. Some estimates suggest more than 10,000 people moving toward Versailles. Inside the palace, news arrived gradually. Versailles had always felt distant from Paris. Physically close, politically insulated. But that insulation was now collapsing. Courtiers gathered in anxious clusters within corridors. Guards strengthened positions near the gates. Ministers hurried through private consultations. Yet the palace was not prepared for this. Versailles had been designed for diplomacy, for ceremony, for the controlled presence of nobles, not for a mass of citizens arriving in anger. By evening, the first groups reached the town of Versailles. Crowds surged through its narrow streets toward the palace square. Rain continued to fall. Torches flickered against wet stone walls. The great facade of the palace loomed ahead, long, glittering, familiar. But something fundamental had changed. For generations, Versailles had been the destination of nobles seeking royal favour. Now it was the destination of ordinary people demanding accountability. The crowd shouted for bread. They shouted for the king. They shouted for the royal family to come to Paris. Some pushed toward the gates. Others gathered near the halls where the Estates General of 1789 had been meeting earlier that year. Inside the palace, the atmosphere turned tense. The king appeared briefly before the crowd and promised to distribute grain and accept certain reforms passed by the Revolutionary Assembly. For a moment, the situation seemed to calm, but the night was far from over. Versailles had never been designed for sleep under pressure. Corridors echoed with footsteps as guards took positions. Courtiers whispered through candlelit chambers. Members of the royal household remained awake, uncertain what the morning might bring. Outside, thousands remained in the courtyard, cold, wet, hungry, waiting. Before dawn on October 6th, a group from the crowd found an unguarded entrance to the palace. They surged inside. The first alarms rang through the corridors. Guards rushed to respond. Chaos spread rapidly. In the confusion, several members of the royal bodyguard were killed as the crowd moved toward the private apartments of Marie Antoinette. For a moment, the palace machine collapsed. The carefully choreographed world of Versailles, its rituals, hierarchies, ceremonies, dissolved into panic. Servants fled through back staircases. Courtiers barricaded doors. Soldiers struggled to regain control. The Queen barely escaped through hidden corridors leading to the king's chambers. Soon, the crowd filled the marble courtyards. Thousands of voices echoed through spaces once reserved for aristocratic ceremony. Versailles had always been loud during festivals, but this sound was different. It was the sound of the nation arriving. Eventually, the king appeared on a balcony overlooking the crowd. He agreed to the demands. The royal family would leave Versailles. They would move to Paris. The centre of royal authority would no longer be the palace built by Louis XIV. It would be the capital, under the watch of the people. When the announcement spread through the courtyard, cheers erupted. But they were not the cheers of courtiers. They were the cheers of citizens who believed they had finally forced the monarchy to listen. Later that day, the royal carriage departed. The king, the queen, their children, members of the court, escorted by the National Guard, surrounded by thousands of marchers returning to Paris. Some carried bread on pikes, some carried muskets, some sang revolutionary songs. Versailles faded behind them. For the first time since 1682, the palace was no longer the centre of French political life. The machine that Louis XIV had built, the palace designed to control power by concentrating it, had failed its final test. Because the system had always depended on distance. Distance between ruler and ruled, distance between spectacle and hardship, distance between Versailles and the people who financed it. On October 5th and 6th, 1789, that distance vanished. The palace had been reached. And once the people reached Versailles, Versailles ceased to function. The court never truly returned. The corridors fell quiet. Ceremonies ended. Candles went unlit. One of the most powerful symbols of European monarchy suddenly stood nearly empty. But the story of Versailles was not over, because what happens to a palace built to embody absolute power when the world that created that power disappears? After October 1789, Versailles fell silent. For more than a century, the palace had functioned like the heart of France, pumping ceremony, influence, and authority through the arteries of the kingdom. Now the heart had stopped. When Louis XVI and the royal family departed for Paris, the court followed. Nobles packed their belongings, servants abandoned their routines, government ministries relocated to the capital. Versailles had been designed to operate only when filled. Without the court, it felt enormous. Empty corridors stretched into darkness. Apartments once crowded with courtiers stood locked and unused. The fountains ran less frequently. Gardens lost the constant attention that had kept them geometrically perfect. The machine had lost its operators, and the revolution had little patience for royal monuments. In the years that followed, the palace faced an uncertain future. Revolutionary officials debated what to do with it. Some argued for demolition, the ultimate symbolic rejection of monarchy. Others saw practical opportunities. Furniture was removed and sold at auction. Precious objects disappeared into private collections. Tapestries, clocks, paintings, and silverware were scattered across Europe. Rooms once decorated for kings became storage spaces. Some halls were repurposed for administrative offices. Others hosted revolutionary exhibitions celebrating the downfall of royal power. Versailles had not only lost its political function, it had lost its identity. Then came the violence of the revolution itself. In 1793, during the most radical phase of the upheaval, Louis XVI was executed in Paris after being condemned by the revolutionary government. The monarchy had ended. Versailles, once the symbol of absolute royal authority, now belonged to a republic. Yet even republics struggle with monuments of power. Destroying Versailles would erase history. Preserving it would risk glorifying the very system the revolution had overthrown. For several years, the palace existed in an awkward limbo, too large to demolish easily, too politically charged to celebrate. The situation changed in the early 19th century when a new figure rose to power in France, Napoleon Bonaparte. Napoleon understood symbolism better than most rulers. He recognized the propaganda value of grand spaces and imperial imagery, but he had little interest in reviving Versailles as a royal residence. Instead, his government maintained the palace selectively, using certain areas for state purposes while leaving much of the complex underutilized. Versailles remained impressive, but it was no longer central. Paris had become the undisputed capital of political life. The true transformation of Versailles came later under another French monarch, Louis Philippe I. In the 1830s, Louis Philippe faced a difficult challenge. His monarchy, established after a revolution in 1830, needed legitimacy. Yet France remained deeply divided over its past. Royalists, Republicans, Bonapartists, and others all claimed competing visions of national identity. Louis Philippe's solution was unusual. He would turn Versailles into a museum, not a museum of kings, a museum of France itself. In 1837, large sections of the palace reopened as the Museum of the History of France. Vast galleries were filled with paintings depicting centuries of national events, battles, revolutions, heroic figures. The palace that once celebrated a single monarch now attempted to narrate an entire nation. Rooms were redesigned, walls filled with monumental historical canvases. Versailles became something different, a stage for memory rather than authority. The strategy worked. By reframing the palace as a national monument rather than a royal residence, Louis Philippe preserved Versailles without restoring the political system that created it. The palace survived, and over time it continued to accumulate new layers of history. One of the most famous occurred in 1919. In the very Hall of Mirrors where kings once held court, diplomats from the victorious Allied powers gathered to sign the Treaty of Versailles. The symbolism was deliberate. Germany had proclaimed its empire in that same hall in 1871 after defeating France during the Franco-Prussian War. Now the defeated German delegation signed a treaty, ending the First World War beneath the same mirrored ceiling. Versailles had become a theatre of global diplomacy, a place where the political narratives of Europe were written and rewritten. Yet the palace itself had changed again. By the 20th century, Versailles was no longer a seat of power, it was a destination. Visitors arrived not as courtiers seeking influence, but as tourists seeking history. Railways made travel easier. Later, automobiles and international flights brought millions of visitors each year. They walked through the Hall of Mirrors, they wandered through the gardens of André Le Nôtre. They photographed fountains once activated only for kings. Versailles became one of the most visited monuments on Earth. The machine still runs, but it runs differently now. Instead of aristocratic prestige, it generates cultural prestige. Instead of royal taxation, it generates tourism revenue. Instead of court ceremony, it offers guided tours, exhibitions, and historical interpretation. The palace employs historians, gardeners, restoration specialists, curators, security staff, and event planners. Even today, maintaining Versailles requires enormous resources. Paintings must be restored, roofs repaired, gardens replanted, water systems maintained. The infrastructure of spectacle still exists, but the audience has changed. Where courtiers once gathered in silk and lace, tourists now gather with cameras and guidebooks. Where ambassadors once negotiated alliances, visitors now stand quietly listening to audio guides. Versailles still impresses, still overwhelms, still radiates the same sense of scale that astonished European diplomats 3 centuries ago. Yet the meaning has shifted. It is no longer a palace of living power. It is a monument to a system that once believed power could be perfectly choreographed. A system that believed authority could be stabilized through architecture, ritual, and spectacle. For more than a century that belief seemed correct. Versailles worked. Until it didn't. Until the arithmetic failed. Until the people arrived. Today, millions walk the same corridors where courtiers once competed for favor. But they walk with a different question in mind. Not how to approach the king, but how such a system could ever have seemed sustainable. Because Versailles was never just about beauty. It was about control, about infrastructure, about the enormous effort required to maintain the illusion of absolute power. And that raises one final question. When we stand in the Hall of Mirrors today, surrounded by reflections of a vanished world, what exactly are we looking at? A masterpiece of art, or the glittering remains of a machine that eventually consumed the nation that built it? Early morning returns to Versailles, before the tour buses arrive, before the courtyards fill with footsteps and camera shutters. The palace is quiet again. Light enters the Hall of Mirrors exactly as it did centuries ago, sliding through tall windows, striking glass, multiplying across the room in 1,000 reflections. For a moment it's possible to imagine the past still lingering here. Candles glowing, silk garments rustling, courtiers gathering in careful ranks, the king approaching. Versailles was designed for moments like this, moments where light, architecture, and human ritual combined to create the illusion of permanence. But permanence was never the point, control was. From the beginning, the palace functioned as something far more deliberate than a royal residence. It was a machine built to manage power inside one of Europe's largest kingdoms. Louis XIV understood that power was not only military strength or legal authority, it was attention, proximity, incentives, the ability to draw ambitious people toward a single centre and keep them there. Versailles accomplished that with extraordinary efficiency. Nobles who once commanded regional armies now competed for ceremonial privileges. Political rivals became spectators. Ambition flowed toward the palace instead of away from it. For decades, the system worked. France dominated European culture. Foreign ambassadors returned home describing a court of astonishing splendour. Other monarchs attempted to imitate the model, building their own palaces, copying Versailles' gardens, reproducing its rituals. Versailles appeared to prove something powerful. That architecture could stabilize authority, that spectacle could sustain legitimacy, that a carefully designed court could transform politics into choreography. And for a long time, that belief seemed correct. But machines operate according to arithmetic. Inputs, outputs, balance. And Versailles required enormous inputs. Labour from thousands of workers, food shipments from distant farms, taxes collected across a kingdom of millions, loans negotiated through an increasingly fragile financial system. The palace itself was not the entire cost, but it symbolised the system consuming those resources. Ceremony required staff, gardens required water, courtiers required status, status required spending. The machine grew, and growth creates momentum. Once Versailles existed, it could not easily shrink. Reducing ceremony would signal weakness. Reducing court life would weaken royal control over the nobility. Reducing spectacle would invite questions about legitimacy. So the machine continued expanding, even when finances strained, even when wars multiplied, even when harvests failed. Inside the palace, the choreography continued. Outside, the numbers changed. Bread prices rose, population increased, debt accumulated. Administrators tried to correct the balance. Ministers proposed reforms. But the system that Versailles helped create made reform difficult. Privilege had become institutional. Influence depended on access, and those closest to the king had the most to lose. Eventually the arithmetic broke. Not in a single dramatic moment, but through accumulation, loan by loan, tax by tax, bad harvest by bad harvest. Until the balance between spectacle and sustainability collapsed. When the crowds marched to Versailles in October 1789, they were not only confronting a palace, they were confronting the symbol of a system that had lost equilibrium. The palace had been built to concentrate power. But concentration has consequences. If admiration fades, resentment concentrates as well. The people arrived, the court departed, and the palace designed to control the elites suddenly found itself powerless before the nation. Today Versailles stands preserved, its gardens restored, its halls polished. Millions visit every year. They see beauty, they see scale, they see one of the most impressive architectural achievements in human history. All of that is true. But Versailles also tells another story, a quieter one, about systems, about incentives, about the hidden infrastructure required to maintain authority. Because the palace reminds us of something every government eventually discovers. Power is not sustained by spectacle alone. It requires balance, economic balance, social balance, political balance. When those balances hold, institutions appear eternal. When they fail, even the grandest structures reveal their fragility. Versailles remains magnificent. The mirrors still catch the morning sun. The fountains still rise on summer afternoons. The gardens still stretch toward the horizon with mathematical precision. But the machine that once operated here is gone, and what remains is not simply a palace. It is a lesson written in stone and glass, a reminder that systems built to display power must also survive the arithmetic that supports them. Otherwise, one day, the mirrors will still shine,